place. American men with a gun over there are telling me I got to beware. But the family stop children, what's that sound? I never look what's going down.
In 1968, President Nixon authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia, and the repercussions were to be felt for generations. This is the story of Cambodia, Pol Pot, and the Khmer Rouge. Before the bombing, Cambodia had seemed to be a sort of Shangri-La, where King Sihanouk played the saxophone and made films starring himself and his queen. But beneath the surface was a different story. Opposition politicians were brutalized, often killed. It was made clear in every possible way that you couldn't oppose the king. It was in this setting that Pol Pot was born, and as a child attended a Buddhist monastery. He was also influenced by the royal palace, as his sister was a concubine to the king.
Pol Pot grew up in the palace where everybody was Khmer, and his upbringing, I think, encouraged him to see the Khmer ethnic group as special.
As a young man, he gained a scholarship to study electrical engineering in France. He was immensely charming. He had an angelic smile and a winning personality.
November 1946, French guns hit the port of Haiphong. A few days later, Ho's guerrillas in turn attack the French. Ho goes into the jungle. The Indochina War is on, and it is to last 8 blood-filled years.
What the Second World War did in Indochina was to show Cambodians that the French, the colonial masters, could be humiliated. Once the Cambodians had seen the French could be humbled, it was never going to be quite the same again.
Ho's headquarters is deep in the jungle. There, he and his most trusted associates forged their plans.
This was the time when all three Indo-Chinese countries, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, were struggling for independence. And the only people in France who supported independence for Cambodia and Vietnam were the communists.
All these people are communists, and there's a lot of them. They march along shouting the same slogans that are shouted on Red Army Square in Moscow. Stop the war in Indochina.
There was a whole group of them in Paris that formed what is known as the Marxist Circle, the Cercle Marxiste. Through that, they also started reading about the French Revolution. The French Revolution overthrew a king. Cambodia had a king. The French Revolution was made up of peasants and intellectuals, and that's what Cambodia had. It was a model that influenced a generation of radicals in Paris. Pol Pot was one of that generation.
Ho and his cabinet must hide from roving bombers in a deep mine shaft. The French know that the enemy hides below them in the jungle. But Ho's fighters have in their favor their mastery of the art of guerrilla warfare, and above all, their fanaticism.
When Pol Pot came back from France, he concluded that the only group that were remotely credible were those that were called the Khmer Viet Minh. The Khmer communists were working with the Vietnamese communists, and Pol Pot himself went and lived in the bush with the Vietnamese. All through Cambodian history, there has always been a kind of paranoia about Vietnam. So for Pol Pot to start seeing the Vietnamese communists as the best hope for Cambodian independence and change in Cambodian society was quite a departure. The Vietnamese took the ascendancy and encouraged the Cambodians to set up cells, both in the cities and in the countryside. However, they were still a very small group of fewer than 250 people. They were marginal in the extreme.
Unlike the Thais, the Cambodians are not members of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. They are not, like the South Vietnamese, markedly pro-Western. They maintain a rigidly neutral policy, aligning themselves with neither West nor East in the dominant struggle of these times. But so long as that neutrality is effective, communism can gain no inroads in Cambodia, provided the country is strong enough to resist the encroachment it does not want.
One of the most important lessons our nation has learned in its years of strength and leadership is that it does not stand alone in its resistance to the communist threat of domination. Nowhere are the will and the strength to resist more vital to us than in the Far East, some of which is already heavily scarred by communist aggression. Passions not known to us stir many of these lands. War and its holocaust, the struggle for and birth of independence.
The most distinguished personalities of the capital, including Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, came to witness the splendor of traditional Cambodian dancing.
This was the time when John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, said, "You're either with us or against us." Sihanouk didn't want that. He said, "We're not with you, we're not against you, we're neutral, we're independent, we are a country, Cambodia, and we have our own policies." And this led to endless hostility and misunderstanding, really a dialogue of the deaf between the Cambodians and the Americans at that time. He walked a tightrope between the great powers until much later on the Vietnam War came along and that knocked him off.
Communism in Cambodia built on what went before. Buddhist monks are taught to renounce all worldly possessions, all effective ties to their families, to their brothers and sisters. That's exactly what Pol Pot did in the Communist Party. You could possess nothing. So in the same way that the Buddhists were absolute in their rejection of possessions, the Cambodian communists were too. When you become a Buddhist monk, you take a religious name. When you became a Cambodian communist, you took a revolutionary name. Saloth Sa became Pol Pot, and in 1963 he was elected leader of the party. He had a vision of Cambodia which was shared by the others, to restore its lost grandeur symbolized by Angkor Wat, the astonishing temples made 600 years earlier. He wanted to make Cambodia strong.
Cambodia is studded with relics of an historic past reaching back to the splendor of the Khmer Empire, which flourished between the 10th and 14th centuries.
Genocides often involve a fetish with the ancient history and glory of the dominating race, a sense of injustice that their ancient history hasn't been borne out in modern times, and that loss of territory or loss of glory needs to be undone and overcome, and their glory needs to be reinstated. And so you find the Angkor era of medieval Cambodia was an inspiration to the Khmer Rouge led by Pol Pot, and the expansionist vision of retaking long-lost territories, especially in Vietnam and the Mekong Delta, was a part of the Pol Pot regime's ambitions. Other lesser well-known features of the Khmer Rouge new leadership of Pol Pot in the 1960s include a romantic agrarian imagination, the view that only the peasantry or only the farmers or only cultivators are the real members of an ethnic group, or are somehow the historically most pure members of an ethnic group. An ideological vision that somehow non-farmers were inferior and were not to be trusted.
In 1967, guerrilla fighting began. The communists set up guerrilla forces and they began a small war. The Khmer Rouge ideology did not begin to emerge until the late 60s and early 70s.
Who threatens freedom in the world? There's only one threat to peace and one threat to freedom, that is presented by the international communist movement.
It's very difficult to know to what extent the Americans closed their eyes to the attempts to get Sihanouk out of power. He certainly suspected that the Americans had it in for him. He stopped accepting American aid and breaking off diplomatic relations with America in 1965 coincided with something that was much bigger, the beginning of the Vietnam War. Sihanouk believed that the South Vietnamese would win, so he was ostensibly neutral, but in fact allowed the North Vietnamese to use not only the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but also the port of Kampong Som to bring in military supplies. The Vietnamese repaid the favor. They refused to support Pol Pot's spluttering guerrilla war.
In Cambodia, a coup d'etat toppled head of state Prince Norodom Sihanouk. The coup came in March when Sihanouk was on a trip to Moscow. Sihanouk's place was taken by General Lon Nol, a former vice president.
Until Sihanouk was overthrown, the Khmer Rouge insurgency was still very small scale. They had a maximum of 2,000 men. Having been ousted, Sihanouk went to China, where he had always had a very good relationship with both Mao and Zhou Enlai, and they encouraged him to make a deal with the Khmer Rouge. Zhou Enlai acted as the intermediary and brought their two sets of views together. In return, Pol Pot played it very cleverly. He didn't use the word communist, he didn't use the word revolution. The messages to Sihanouk were basically that they would work together and that they would bring Sihanouk back to the throne. Sihanouk agreed, which gave the Khmer Rouge a respectability they could never have had any other way. Because for the peasants all over Cambodia, the king, the divine figure, was with Pol Pot. The movement grew exponentially after that.
Cambodia, a small country of 7 million people, has been a neutral nation since the Geneva Agreement of 1954, an agreement, incidentally, which was signed by the government of North Vietnam. American policy since then has been to scrupulously respect the neutrality of the Cambodian people.
The administration of Mr. Nixon did start what was known as the secret bombing of Cambodia. Obviously, it was secret maybe in the United States, but it wasn't secret to the people in Cambodia who were the victims.
I still think we ought to take the dice off now. I think the less brown people got to calm down about who understand. Well, no, I'd rather see some nuclear bombs. We got that ready. And that, I think, would just create too much. The nuclear bomb, that probably. I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
From 69 to 73, the bombing expanded way beyond the Ho Chi Minh Trail, far across Cambodia. More than 500,000 tons of bombs were dropped by U.S. aircraft on Cambodia.
Mr. President, I'm wondering if you, in light of what we now know that there were 15 months of bombing Cambodia previous to your statement, whether you owe an apology to the American people.
Certainly not, and certainly not to the Cambodian people. Because as far as this area is concerned, the area of approximately 10 miles, which was bombed during this period, no Cambodians had been in it for years. It was totally occupied by the North Vietnamese communists.
Perhaps 100,000 or more Cambodian peasants were killed in the rain of bombs.
People at that point turned anti-American. And since we in the United States supported the Lon Nol government, the bombing undoubtedly helped to create what was later known as the Khmer Rouge.
The Khmer Rouge were able to use the outrage that caused to recruit, and they did so massively with the support of the Vietnamese communists and also of Prince Sihanouk, who was now their ally and who remained popular in Cambodia despite his overthrow.
Sihanouk's relations with the Khmer Rouge were strained from the start. He didn't meet Pol Pot. He didn't even know who he was. There were pictures that showed Pol Pot and Sihanouk in the same group, but Pol Pot's identity was never disclosed.
The Khmer Rouge never really accepted him as an ally, never trusted him, and worked with him, used his name, but in secret purged the royalist forces from their alliance in the Cambodian countryside.
The Vietnamese stepped up their training activity, but really quite quickly the Cambodians were able to cast off the Vietnamese sponsorship. The Vietnamese pulled out to fight in Vietnam, and the Cambodians took over more and more of the war themselves.
ខែមករាឆ្នាំ 1975 ខ្មែរក្រហមដែលកាន់កាប់ប្រាសាទអង្គរតាំងពីឆ្នាំ 1971 មក ក៏ចាប់ផ្ដើមបញ្ជូនកងទ័ពឲ្យធ្វើដំណើរវាយលុកនិងដណ្ដើមដោយកម្លាំងអាវុធឆ្ពោះមកទីក្រុងភ្នំពេញរដ្ឋធានីនៃប្រទេសកម្ពុជា
By the beginning of 1975, the Khmer Rouge controlled all of the countryside. The tide had turned, and it was clear the Long Nol troops wouldn't hold out much longer. The rumors about what was going on in the Khmer Rouge areas were making people frightened. So when a provincial town was threatened, everyone that could would try and get to Phnom Penh for apparent safety.
In Cambodia, we have an immediate emergency. We have a situation where if a supplemental is not voted within the next few weeks, it is certain that Cambodia must fall because it will run out of ammunition.
ខែមីនាឆ្នាំ 1975 ខ្មែរក្រហមនឹងដើមបានជោគជ័យថ្មីៗថែមទៀត ផ្លូវទន្លេរវាងភ្នំពេញនិងវៀតណាមខាងត្បូងត្រូវកាត់ផ្ដាច់ នាវាគ្រប់ធនដែលបម្រើឲ្យសាធារណរដ្ឋខ្មែររបស់លន់នល់ត្រូវបាញ់ពន្លិញ
The situation in Phnom Penh got more and more difficult. In the early months of 1975, 2.25 million refugees were flooding in. The Khmer Rouge were sending mortars and rocket attacks into the suburbs of the city. And of course, they were completely indiscriminate. To the Khmer Rouge, this was simply what people deserved. They'd run away to Phnom Penh. If they got killed, they shouldn't have been there in the first place. Food went into very short supply, and life was becoming very difficult.
In Cambodia, the situation is tragic. The communist side has shown no interest in negotiation, compromise, or a political solution. And yet, for the past 3 months, the beleaguered people of Phnom Penh have fought on, hoping against hope that the United States would not desert them, but instead provide the arms and ammunition they so badly needed. By what we do now, the world will know our courage, our constancy, and our compassion. And may God ever guide us to do what is right. Thank you.
Ngàyទី 15 និងទី 16 មេសាឆ្នាំ 1975 ខ្មែរក្រហមបានផ្ដុំកម្លាំងវាយលុកទៅលើកងការពារខ្សែក្រវ៉ាត់ភ្នំពេញរបស់កងកម្លាំងពួកលន់នល់
Finally, on April 17th, 1975, the Khmer Rouge marched in carrying their weapons and were first hailed by the population, celebrating that at least Long Nol had gone. The war was over. What happened next would make Cambodia a totally different reality from any other country in the rest of the world. Phnom Penh was evacuated. People went round with bullhorns saying, "Prepare to leave your homes. You have 3 hours to get out. The city is being evacuated because the Americans are going to bomb it." That was the excuse. The Khmer Rouge went round checking all the houses. If they found anybody, they shot them. 3 million people went out of Phnom Penh in the space of 72 hours. The refugees were sent back to the countryside, and the town dwellers were sent away to work on the farms.
here is the totalitarian aspect of the communist revolution that Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia led, which is that they really did seek total power in the countryside of Cambodia, and ending urban life as it had been was part of that grab for total power.
We foreigners had been told by the Khmer Rouge we had half an hour to get out of the Hotel Phnom and make our way to the embassy. There was total confusion. We moved in, we had to jump over the wall, the gates were closed. Cambodians, terrified of having to go out into the countryside, were also jumping over the wall and sheltering in the French embassy. There was a feeling that perhaps they might burst in at any time, and Prince Sirikh Matak, who was one of the architects of the coup against Prince Sihanouk in 1970, he was in the embassy seeking political asylum, and all these people were finally told by the French that the Khmer Rouge had asked them to leave, or the Khmer Rouge would come in and it seemed perhaps execute them on the spot if they did not leave. And Prince Sirikh Matak instantly left rather bravely. The gates were opened and he walked out into the street and was escorted away by the Khmer Rouge.
Probably to his death.
Probably to his death.
At that time, one of my sisters had a very young baby, and she had to evacuate to a most protected building in the city. They were planning to return and collect me later, but it was too late. The Khmer Rouge blocked the road. So I actually was home alone when the Khmer Rouge came to Phnom Penh. So I joined the crowd, and then I traveled weeks and weeks, and then I managed to go to my mother's home village in Takao. There's nothing to eat. I remember I would pretend in my thought that it's a food, and then I go to sleep every day, and it worked. In that circumstances, nothing but survival, and you do anything to survive. You know, you sacrifice anything. Friendship, humanities, love, care, foods, to save yours.
There were lots of kind of well-meaning third world theorists in the early 70s who thought theoretically what Pol Pot was trying to do was just great. Because he was saying, we're a developing country, we only have agriculture as our base, let everybody work on agriculture, and we'll build up agricultural surpluses, capital, we'll eventually use that to start industry, and then we will develop into a modern country. I mean, it's textbook stuff. Where it went wrong was with the extreme brutality with which it was administered. The agricultural yields which the leadership wanted were unrealistically high. The peasants' officials, fearing for their own skins, reported that they'd been reached, and in order to send grain, they starved the people. And that sort of cycle set in, where everything was being falsified, the leadership realized that things were going wrong, people were starving to death. Obviously, the policies were right, so there must be sabotage. Who's doing the sabotage? Agents of Vietnam, the eternal enemy. And this developed into a spiral where Cambodia went into the realms of complete madness.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
1.7 million of Cambodia's 8 million population perished in less than 4 years.
The end of our elaborate plans, the end.
It's one of the fastest cases of mass murder and population destruction in the history of genocide.
Under Pol Pot's system, you couldn't choose where to live. You had no money, so you couldn't choose what to buy. You couldn't choose what work to do. You couldn't choose how long you could work. You couldn't even choose your wife without the party agreeing. You had no freedom at all. There were prisons in the Khmer Rouge areas from the early 70s, places to which people were taken and were never seen again. The man who was running one of these prisons, Duke, was appointed to head the principal interrogation center known as S21, which was in a former secondary school. It was a gruesome place where 20,000 people passed through. Once you fell under suspicion, you were taken to S21, and the object was to get a confession. You were tortured until they thought they had a confession that would prove whatever they wanted to prove.
Anh ấy phépគាត់ថា 20,000 នាក់ហ្នឹងហ្នឹងហើយតែ 7 នាក់ហ្នឹងគាត់ស្លាប់អស់ 4 ហើយនៅសល់តែ 3 ទេសល់ប៊ូមេងវណ្ណាតហើយអានេះខ្ញុំហើយវាវាយអ៊ំខ្លាំងពេកវាយបាក់ដៃបាក់អាកូនដៃបាទយើងយកដៃរងអញ្ចឹងបាក់កូនដៃបាទឃើញទេក្តាប់អត់នេះទេហើយអាកញ្ចក់ជើងហ្នឹងនេះអាកញ្ចក់ជើងនេះយកទៅកាប់មូលចឹងអត់ដាច់វាកត្រាក់ឲ្យដាច់បាទហើយវាឲ្យឆក់ខ្សែភ្លើងដាក់ជាយើងញាត់ថាច់ចឹងដូចទុះអាលាក្បាលយើងចេញចឹងអាភ្នែកចេញមកសិតតែភ្លើងចាយចឹងហើយយើងហៅគេអត់លឺទេដាក់ 2 ដងស្លាប់ 2 ដងហើយអានេះមិនបានគេដាក់លួសបលាហ្នឹងបាទដាក់លួសបលាហ្នឹងមានអ្នកទោសលោតពីលើមក បាទម្ល៉េះឲ្យគេដាក់លួសបលាហ្នឹងកុំឲ្យអ្នកទោសលោតបាទហើយអាលួសបលាហ្នឹងមានដាក់ខ្សែភ្លើងទៀតយប់បាទមានដាក់ខ្សែភ្លើង
រហូតដល់ឆ្នាំ 1977 ថ្ងៃ 30 ខែ 12 ឆ្នាំ 77 ហ្នឹងគឺខ្ញុំត្រូវអង្គការចាប់ខ្លួនប៉ុន្តែមកដល់នេះបានតែ 2-3 ថ្ងៃហ្នឹងយើងចាប់ផ្ដើមបាត់បង់អាក្តីសង្ឃឹមនឹងអស់លីងពីព្រោះការស្លាប់ជាបន្តហើយនឹងសកម្មភាពក្នុងស21ហ្នឹងគួរយើងព្រឺខ្លាចមែនតើហើយយើងនឹងអស់សង្ឃឹមទាំងអស់គ្នាអត់មានថាអ្នកណាអាចរួចពីក្នុងនឹងបានទេតែដោយសារសំណាងល្អខ្ញុំមានជំនាញខាងគំនូរអត់ទេសម័យនោះគេយករូបថតមកឲ្យយើងមើលរូបថតធំៗប៉ុណ្ណឹងឲ្យយើងគូចម្លងចេញពីរូបថតហ្នឹងមកយើងមិនសង្ឃឹមថាយើងអាចធ្វើបានឲ្យគេទេប៉ុន្តែដោយការប្រឹងប្រែងដូចថាយើងមានដូចថាមានតែពេលតន្តិចប៉ុណ្ណឹងទេបើថាយើងអាចធ្វើឲ្យគេពេញចិត្តបានអាហ្នឹងយើងរស់តែបើថាធ្វើមិនបានទេយើងក៏ត្រូវស្លាប់ដែរបាទខ្ញុំសូមជំរាបជេពេលដែលខ្ញុំរៀនសូត្រនៅកន្លែងដូចនេះគេដាក់ពាក្យស្លោករបស់គេថាធ្វើបដិវត្តដើម្បីរំដោះពីចក្រពត្តិអាមេរិកពីលន់នល់គេថាវណ្ណៈអធនអាណាពីអ្នកមានណាបាទខ្ញុំសូមជម្រាបថាពេលដែលខ្ញុំដឹកទៅជើងឯកចឹងពីទួលស្លែងទៅជើងឯកហ្នឹងក៏ដូចគេបញ្ជាដូចថាទៅដូចបញ្ជាឬមួយក៏ធោបញ្ជាអញ្ចឹងសួរហៅខ្ញុំមកសួរពេលដែលដឹកទៅហ្នឹងគឺខ្ញុំអ្នកកត់ឈ្មោះអ្នកដែលយកទៅសម្រាប់ហ្នឹងខ្ញុំអ្នកកត់ឈ្មោះមកជួបជាមួយគេថាគេសួរថាមិនឯងដាច់ខាតយើងត្រូវថាដាច់ខាតបើយើងថាមិនដាច់ខាតគឺយើងខ្មាំងអញ្ចឹងយើងដាច់ខាតឲ្យវាយមួយមើលបាទវាយមួយយើងយកដៃពីគេមកយកដៃគេមកវាយអញ្ចឹងកមួយទៅបាទវាយឲ្យបោះដៃឲ្យទុកគេដែរបាទយើងដើរទៅវិញទៅខ្លះគេយកទៅសួរចម្លើយមកវិញគេវាយឈឺសែកនៅក្នុងបន្ទប់ក្នុងអីហ្នឹងបាទលទ្ធភាពអស់នេះគឺឃើញវាអនាធមវិធានណាព្រោះអ្នកទោសមុននឹងយកសម្លាប់គឺខ្លួនតបៅពេញទាំងអស់បាទបាននិយាយថាខ្ញុំមិនមែនប្រព្រឹត្តដោយអំពើអយុត្តិធម៌ខ្លួនឯងដែរគឺថាគេបញ្ជាបើមិនធ្វើគឺយើងមានអីមានស្លាប់ព្រោះគេបាននិយាយថាអ្នកណាម្នាក់ដែលដើរមិនទាន់កង់វត្តសាសគេគឺនឹងគេកំទេចចោលបាទ
It was not until 1977 when Pol Pot went to Beijing for his first and only official visit abroad that he revealed that he was the leader of the party. Not just that, he revealed for the first time that there was a communist party in Cambodia. Until then, it had been kept secret. Pol Pot was a name that was simply not known outside a very small leading circle. Again, a degree of secrecy and reclusiveness that hadn't been seen in any other party, any other country, or any other leader.
their beloved party secretary, Comrade Pol Pot, and other leading comrades of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cambodia and of the government have come to attend this meeting. Comrade Pol Pot pointed out that we have won initial victory, but our enemies will not be reconciled to defeat.
Pol Pot was not only secretive, he was also morbidly suspicious. And as he became more removed from reality, he saw spies everywhere.
The border problem is a very small problem. That is not important. The real problem is that Vietnam wants to take possession of the whole Cambodia, to put Cambodia under his thumb.
Pol Pot suspected real or imagined opponents in the party of being in the pay of the Vietnamese. Mistrust grew and quickly resulted in a border war, with fighting and massacres, women having their stomachs ripped open, children burnt alive. It was horrifying, as most things in Pol Pot's Cambodia were.
The Vietnamese army retaliated in force in December of 1978 and January of 79, and took Phnom Penh on January 7th and continued pushing the Khmer Rouge forces to the west of the country, and eventually settled in Thailand in guerrilla camps, from which they spent the next 20 years attacking back across the border and attempting to reclaim power.
The Khmer didn't even organize a serious defense against the North Vietnamese. They were so secretive that they did not admit publicly when things were going badly. They fell because they had antagonized the North Vietnamese so intensely. The North Vietnamese decided they could not live with this regime next door. They detested the Pol Pot regime and they wanted it out.
After the overthrow of the Khmer Rouge, city life was coming back slowly. There were weddings, there were ordinations of Buddhist monks, wats were reopening, schools were reopening. The university didn't reopen until 1988. The Khmer Rouge had killed nearly all of the professors and academics. The medical school, however, did reopen in 1979 and began training doctors, very few of whom had survived the Khmer Rouge period.
It then became very much involved in East-West geopolitics because Vietnam was backed by the Soviet Union. My enemy's enemy is my friend, and Vietnam's enemy, and therefore the Soviet Union's enemy, was Pol Pot, which made Pol Pot our friend, despite everything that he'd done. And so the West was in the invidious, completely morally unjustifiable position of backing the Khmer Rouge against the Vietnamese.
When the Khmer Rouge took power in Phnom Penh in April 1975, the United States was volubly opposed to the Khmer Rouge, but secretly Kissinger told the Thai foreign minister, "You should tell the Cambodians that we will be friends with them. They are murderous thugs, but we won't let that stand in our way." Even after the overthrow of the Pol Pot regime, the United States, along with China and the Southeast Asian countries, sponsored the Khmer Rouge exile government to maintain Cambodia's seat in the UN. 12 to 14 years after their overthrow, the Khmer Rouge were still representing their victims in the UN, and the Khmer Rouge flag was flying over New York.
During these years of civil war after the Vietnamese occupied, the pendulum swung back and forth. In the dry season, the North Vietnamese would launch an offensive and they'd drive the Khmer Rouge back. In the wet season, the Khmer Rouge would creep back again and reoccupy their former positions. And neither side had a decisive advantage. The peace talks began in Paris. Eventually they came to a hobbled agreement whereby the Khmer Rouge were to have a role in the governance of Cambodia alongside the former Vietnamese-controlled government. It didn't work, and the civil war resumed, but with the Khmer Rouge in a very much weaker position. In the end, it was Pol Pot's suspiciousness that sank him. One of his oldest colleagues, Song Sen, who'd been his defense minister for so long, and his wife, Yun Yat, also in the movement and a member of the Politburo for years, were living not far away from Pol Pot. Pol Pot suspected that Song Sen and his wife were negotiating secretly with government forces, and he ordered them to be killed. And they were killed extremely bloodily, all the members of the family, including a baby, the grandson. When Tamok, the military commander, discovered this, he thought no one was safe. So he surrounded Pol Pot's headquarters. Pol Pot himself managed to escape, but he was later caught and put on a show trial, a complete spectacle. Pol Pot was very sick by that stage and was kept under house arrest.
But in his last and only television interview, he showed no remorse, no grief. An old man, broken, but in the fashion of all dictators, to the last, unrepentant. Not since Hitler's has one man's death been so welcomed. After months of rumor, these pictures from Cambodia today appear to confirm the end of one of the world's bloodiest ever tyrants.
When I began researching and conducted interviews in France with survivors of the regime and refugees, and then in Cambodia itself with a large number, hundreds of survivors in 1980 and 81, I met an international lawyer, Gregory Stanton, who had come up with the idea of bringing the Khmer Rouge to the World Court for Genocide. The tribunal was established in Phnom Penh, a joint mixed tribunal of Cambodian government and United Nations involvement. With the first case, the prison commandant, Duc, who led the S-21 prison in Phnom Penh, which led to the deaths of perhaps 16,000 inmates during the Khmer Rouge period.
The chamber finds Kang Kech-Yew guilty of crimes against humanity, persecution on political grounds, subsuming the crimes and against humanity of extermination, encompassing murder, enslavement, imprisonment, torture, including one instance of rape, and other inhumane acts.
For Duc, the tribunal has been concluded with a conviction of a 30-year sentence, and that 30-year sentence has been reduced by the amount of time served already in jail, which is approximately 11 years.
This verdict cannot bring my sister back, very clear. But why I support it? Because it helps us to put the past into perspective, and we can educate our children, rebuild our society. They cannot die in prison. Had he have a chance to stay alive after 20 years, he would come back with a new society that no longer allowed to be victimized by him.
The next 4 cases apparently will include charges of genocide against Pol Pot's number 2, Nguyen Chia, his head of state, Khieu Samphan, Deputy Prime Minister Yang Sari, and Yang Thirit, who was a cabinet minister in the Khmer Rouge period. These are the most senior surviving leaders of the Khmer Rouge.
Case 2 would be a test how close that the government of Cambodia and the UN can work together in the eye of the victim, since both of them were associated with the Khmer Rouge one way or the other in the past. It's a test of their trust, of their honesty in the eye of the survivor of the Khmer Rouge. It takes a long time to get a textbook, so it came out in 2007, and in the last 3 years we have managed to distribute almost 500,000 copies. The program is intended for grade 9 and 12, which consists of 1 million students. But right now the government expanded to the first year of every single university in the country as well. In the classroom of 60 students, everywhere in the country, there's always children of the perpetrator inside the classroom. In our culture, we were taught that in order to look into a better future, you have to look back first. And that's exactly what we do with the Khmer Rouge. It's all for the younger generation.
បាទនោះពលពតនឹងប្រាប់ថាកូនហើយកាលរបបពីមុនអត់មានលុយចាយអត់មាននេះទេណាគឺលុយក៏អត់ចាយបាយក៏អត់បានគ្រប់គ្រាន់មិនnóiកូនឯងខំប្រឹងឯងបច្ចុប្បន្នឥឡូវនេះស្រមន់ដៃជួហ៊ុនសែននឹងគាត់ឧបត្ថម្ភប៉ុណ្ណឹងហើយដីក៏មិនចែកឲ្យដូចគ្នាទាំងអស់បាទហើយមិនnóiឲ្យកូនចៅនឹងណែនាំកូនចៅតាមហ្នឹង
There's 5 million direct survivors today, but there's 9 million young people who were born after the Khmer rule, and among these 9 million, they're either children of the victim or perpetrator, nationwide. That's Cambodia today. I think Pol Pot is just stupid. You know, you look at Khmer Rouge 4-year plan. It's very stupid to expect that each bird can produce 3 tons of rice per hectare. It's just like, you know, you're not a tractor. It's just so stupid plan. He actually escaped justice. He escaped his responsibility through death.
I hope the future will be good to Cambodia, and I hope all humanity will realize that the Cambodian people went through hell, and unfortunately, the whole world remained quiet.
And you look back what have done, Cambodia now ready to turn a new page of the history. Cambodia must get out from being a survivor, become educator, engineer, doctor, filmmaker, lawyers, and move. And that's the only way that we can fully punish the Khmer Rouge the way we wanted to.